Science fiction is the true literature of the 20th century, showing us the present through an image of the future.
What science fiction tells you about is the same thing that any other kind of fiction tells you about, which is the world we live in.
I don't think there is any science fiction movie that I've seen or have made that has anything to do with the future in the first place.
I'm always quoting my friend Ray Bradbury. I don't try to predict the future, I try to prevent it.
Science fiction can prepare the reader for unpleasant surprises, but the surprises are going to come all the same.
Terminator was a very, very cheap movie, and it's a movie which works because of the strength of its premise. Its premise being, we have this central time-travelling idea. A robot from the future comes back to the past to reinvent the present, and that's a very, very strong idea. There's not a whole load of special effects in Terminator. When you look at it, it's very, very basic, bog standard effects, but it doesn't matter because it's an ideas film.
Cinema picked up on time travel from the word go. I mean, there are silent movies where people are in train wrecks and the force of the wreck knocks them back to Arthur's England. Connecticut Yankee, I don't know, it's a toss-up whether it was H.G. Wells or Mark Twain who invented time travel.
One of the ideas that science fiction deals with when you talk about time-traveling science fiction is the idea that if you go back in time and change an event in the past, you can somehow reshape the future. People always pick up on the philosophical side of it by saying, well, would that be true? You know, if you went back and you killed Hitler, could you avoid the Second World War? But what happens if you perhaps tread on a butterfly and therefore you change the course of the evolution of history? What they don't pick up on is that that's not really what science fiction is talking about when it's talking about those things. What it's talking about is the way in which you can or cannot control your own environment and the effect that the past has on the present.
Look, I am not stupid, you know. They cannot make things like that yet.
Not yet. Not for about 40 years.
Are you saying it's from the future?
One possible future. From your point of view, I don't know tech stuff.
Then you're from the future too, is that right?
Right.
When I was about 7, my parents gave me a copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne. I didn't know it was science fiction, of course. I knew it was just a wonderful story. Almost immediately, I stumbled onto H.G. Wells and The Time Machine, and I'm afraid there was no turning back for me after that.
Science fiction found its first mass audience in the pulp magazines of the 1920s, where stories of time travel fired the public imagination.
They started in 1926, science fiction magazines. They were going to teach children and young adults about the world to come. And they did so with very limited success for a little while until they realized that what they really needed to do was tell stories about the world to come. Within a year or so, they were reducing their reprints. They were buying in from England, where people like Wells had been running for a number of years, and bringing in the pulp writers.
Eventually, I ran out of everything that the library had in the way of H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and John Taine, and the other people who published real books. So, willy-nilly, I turned to those horrible magazines and discovered that behind the hideous exterior were some wonderful stories.
Today, the famous Kraft TV cameraman focuses on outer space.
Control deck to all stations. Stand by to raise shift. Blast off. -5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0!
the 1940s was perhaps the last period in Western civilization that it was possible to think that the world of science, the world of progress, the world of big bulldozers, and the world itself might marry happily.
Oh, hi there. You know, one of the first things we learned about space travel here at Space Academy was the importance of high-quality, high-energy fuel for the blastoff. And that goes not just for rocket ships, but for people, including spacemen and potential spacemen, like you kids out there. You know, high-quality candy like Kraft caramels gives your body the kind of fuel it needs for quick takeoffs.
Early time travel stories reflected an innocent view of the world, but already some writers were using science fiction to comment on their own time. Orwell's 1984 was really about 1948. Indeed, many writers were already playing with time travel to alter history. Cinema picked up on this theme, and films such as The Philadelphia Experiment and its sequel look at the consequences of reversing the outcome of World War II.
In our story, they don't, the Germans don't care about altering history because they have no sense of what the history is. They're trying to win the war. So they learn how to fly a stealth bomber in a matter of days, and they bomb Washington, and suddenly history has changed.
The premise is relatively simple. I'm not sure if you know the original Philadelphia Experiment, but it was essentially about things moving through time vortexes. Into some people came forward from the 40s into the early 80s when the movie was originally made. The concept that I had and introduced into the script is really to do with alternate realities. I also done a student film when I was at USC, which was a film that was a nightmare scenario, or set in a kind of nightmare scenario USA, which had been taken over by the religious right and was in a sort of state of civil war. I would not say that I was passionate a science fiction freak in any sense. What I enjoy about it, particularly in the context of American film, is the opportunity to sit back. It's almost one of the few worlds that in the American genre of film allows you really to kind of comment on society as we live in it. And for some reason it really ties in to the whole American psyche, that you can create a world which allows you to comment on the world you're from.
Science fiction movies that we see and are making are more a reflection on what they're now and extrapolating that a little bit, making it bigger or spreading it out over all the streets of the town, say, instead of in one street. But that it is not really an indication of what the future is going to bring us. Fortunately, I would say, because most of these visions in the movies are pretty dark, you know.
Very bad things happen in science fiction, it has to be said. It's not really about progress, it's generally about things going wrong.
Let's get out of here.
Get out.
Early magazines had robots battling for supremacy in extravagant space operas. But after 1937, with John W. Campbell as editor, the magazine Astounding took science more seriously. Isaac Asimov championed a valiant breed of robot who could solve our problems through technology. This golden age was to last throughout the 40s.
Under John W. Campbell, there were suddenly writers who took very seriously what they were writing about. Robert A. Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Theodore Sturgeon, who emerged from Campbell's workshop, as it were.
Isaac Asimov's robots were, in the first instance, a literary device to clean the pulp field of robots which ran around raping women. In the second instance, it was an argument about the nature of artificial intelligence.
Well, in the wrong hands, mightn't such a tool become a deadly weapon?
No, Doctor. Not even though I were the mad scientist of the tape thrillers, because, you see, there happens to be a built-in safety factor. Commander, may I borrow that formidable-looking sidearm of yours? Thank you. Robbie, point this thing at that Althea Frutex out there on the terrace. Fire. Now turn around here. Point it at the commander. Fire. You see, he's helpless, locked in a sub-electronic dilemma between my direct orders and his basic inhibitions against harming rational beings. Cancelled.
What's interesting about the robot, therefore, in Forbidden Planet, is that you have a kind of ambivalent relationship with it all the way through. You know it's a robot, therefore you don't trust it. You know it is the product of Dr. Morbius, and therefore you don't trust it. And yet, of all the characters in the film, apart from Leslie Nielsen, it is the most trustworthy character. So it's like, what does it represent? It represents our ambition. It represents the things that we want to be. It represents man's own desire to control his environment.
In the 50s, robots became much more complex, with exotic cyborgs and androids emerging in the work of many writers.
The most important writer of the early 1950s was Philip K. Dick. He is the prime writer of the 50s. The paranoia, the insecurity, the sense that reality was not a secure thing any longer, all were expressed by Dick in hundreds of short stories, a dozen or so non-SF novels, and his famous SF novels.
Dick's works have often been cannibalized by people without really respect. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was a lovely, lovely story about we can build things that are human, are animal, and can we tell the difference? These things function as well as we certainly do. And they slapped it all together in that very high-tech, good-looking movie, Blade Runner, but they didn't even put the name on the film, which was a shame because for me, the name really represented the book.
I've never been reading too much about science fiction or reading science fiction. I have never been addicted to that. I was interested in comic books that were about science fiction or had science fiction characters, the Flash Gordon type of stuff. And then for a long time I thought it was all stupid.
Where's the fireworks?
Oh! Look! The Solarite ship is nearly upon us! To the caverns for your lives! It's locked!
Ming is no more. The world is safe.
It's only again when I came to the United States that, not that my interest in science fiction then started again. It was just that the first movie I did in the United States was a science fiction movie. And when I got that script, that started my interest again. So it was, for me, a feeling of going back to my childhood.
Goddamn rebels blew up the airport back of Fogo yesterday.
Great. We were going there next week. Hey, what was that? Hey, look. Bucket Boys Online.
I got the script of RoboCop, I started reading it, and I thought it was very stupid, you know. I thought it was silly and really not something I wanted to do. I just threw it away, basically. And my wife picked it up, and she started to read it. And after she had read it, she said, well, I think you have to reread that because it's an interesting situation. It's an interesting script, interesting levels, interesting characters, and she convinced me to read it again.
Hello. I haven't really had a chance to introduce myself. I'm Ann Lewis. Do you have a name?
Robots have come to embody the idea of how much we are in control of our own personality, how much we are the product of the things around us, and how much our minds and our bodies are divorced. When you get onto movies, like RoboCop is a good example, recently Universal Soldier, the subjects that they throw up are, when you start dismembering the body and you leave the mind intact, how much of the person is left.
And it was great to see it with an audience because they participated very much. I saw it with, in New York with a very mixed ethnical audience. And it was great at the end of the movie when the shooting is over and Murphy walks out of that big office there, the boardroom, and the old man is saying,
"Nice shooting, son. What's your name?"
But the audience, before he could even open his mouth, Peter Weller, the audience was already yelling, "Murphy!" And it was so great to see how the audience had by then identified with the character. And I think one of the really strong things about RoboCop is that there is some emotion there. There is something throughout the movie of a soul.
The blueprint of the society we live in today was being laid down in the 1950s. First jet travel, consumer society, television, the media landscape, supermarkets, motorways, airport, the airport culture. All those things we take for granted and which shape our lives today were being defined for the first time in the 1950s. And I wanted to write about this world of change, threatened with nuclear war, with sort of science for the first time being seen in a rather sinister eye.
Can you see that plane in the sky?
I see the plane.
Watch it. Perhaps we can get back to the meeting without any more skepticism.
People by the 50s had lost that optimistic confidence in the ability of science to fulfill all the dreams of mankind. Instead, you saw science about to fulfill all the nightmares of mankind. The prospect of nuclear war was hours away.
I think one of the reasons that we're fascinated with the idea of Armageddon is that one of the things that science fiction does is to try and extrapolate what we're doing now to its most extreme conclusion. And if you believe that what we are doing now is at all non-creative or destructive, the way you dramatise that most powerfully is to say, well, it's going to end up in the end of mankind.
The seconds tick by slowly until the glare of a tremendous thermonuclear explosion blazes from its surface.
The rings of Saturn. They sure didn't spare any atoms when they loaded that charge.
Apocalyptic visions, utopian futures, and social experiments have always been part of science fiction. Then, in the revolutionary 60s, a new wave of writers emerged. In Britain, Michael Moorcock, as editor of New Worlds magazine, fostered daring experimentation with both style and content.
That crowd that is loosely called the New Wave, and I think you could just say the generation of the 1960s, are still the ones that seem to me to have done the greatest work in print with science fiction. Nothing written since there, or by writers that have appeared since then, has had the same impact on me. There was a wonderful confluence there of the science fiction imagery and what was going on in the real world in the 1960s. the kind of surreal sense of history accelerating madly out of control, which is what the 1960s felt like, that was best conveyed, I think, in the new wave science fiction, as opposed to any realist literature that was desperately trying to keep up with the times.
One thing that brought a tremendous change in the science fiction audience was the expansion into the visual media. What I mean is the coming of the Star Trek television series. Star Trek brought in eager, avid, not very critical, young fans, many, though not all of them female. The readership of science fiction circa 1967 or so took an immense leap.
Prior to actually sitting and watching the Star Trek shows, women were under the impression that you did, in fact, have to have some scientific background to write science fiction. But when they realized through watching the shows that it was just a matter of being able to say, you know, the matter, antimatter implosion is imminent, women thought, oh, well, we can do that too. That's not hard.
Every story I read practically had as its main character a white man who drank and smoked too much and who was about 30. So I began writing for my submission about white men who drank and smoked too much and who were about 30. It's not surprising that these were rejected.
For the first time, women writers like Ursula Le Guin and Joanna Russ used science fiction both to reach a wide audience and explore feminist issues.
The new wave was interesting, but I think really the women's movement had more of an effect on my writing. One of our teachers was Joanna Russ, and one of the first things she did was get all the women to stop using their initials, stop writing under their initials and under male pseudonyms, and under androgynous names. Just the idea that maybe we could get in without pretending to be somebody else was a new idea for us.
I don't want to be insulted in terms of the human relationships that occur in the book. I don't want people behaving in adolescent ways in the book. I don't think that I harbored adolescent power fantasies. It seems to me that a lot of science fiction plays too.
The cancellation of the space program contributed to the bleak outlook found in many books of the 70s. Stories were now set on Earth and reflected the uncertainties of the post-60s era.
The best writers of science fiction in the 70s all consciously or unconsciously perceived themselves as myth makers. Samuel R. Delany, Roger Zelazny, Ballard, Aldous. They were dealing with archetypical material against the enormous screen that the future provides, and were running social experiments, philosophical experiments of the gaudiest kind.
Cinema also provided some very grim visions of the future. Westworld parodies consumerism with a theme park peopled by robots who serve man's wildest desires. Along with films like Clockwork Orange, Soylent Green, and Silent Running, Westworld explored a crazy world of technology gone mad.
Westworld is a film which sets out to parody, it's like a black comic film, parody the idea of consumerism, of modern consumerism, of the modern packaging of pleasure and the packaging of sex and the packaging of fantasy, and to show that to be corrupted and potentially dangerous. So Westworld has a very, very basically straightforward brief, which is we're going to show you a society in which everybody can have everything they want and it all goes hideously wrong.
I'm troubled about the fear of technology that is intensifying, though there always has been back to the days of the Luddites. But I think one role of science fiction is to serve as an insulator against what Alvin Toffler called future shock. Those of us who are steeped in the concepts of science fiction are always prepared for what's coming next. We may reach a point where we are horrified by what's coming next, but at least we can't say we're surprised by it.
Storage Area 9 self-destructed last week and destroyed the ship's entire supply of toilet paper. That's all.
John Carpenter was doing a graduate film then, which ultimately ended up being Dark Star, and it was a science fiction film. And I went to work with him on it, and in so doing, I brought with me an entire childhood of familiarity with the themes and devices of science fiction, and for the first time, it occurred to me I might be involved in science fiction again.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, fire!
Some space travel films of the early 50s strove for a degree of scientific accuracy. Based on a Robert Heinlein novel, George Powell's production of Destination Moon drew on the expertise of scientists working on the American space program.
The picture you've been reading about in every important national magazine and newspaper. Among them, Life. This week, the New York Times, Popular Science, Seeing Stars, Popular Mechanics, Parade, the New York Daily News.
Destination Moon, for instance, that was the first serious science fiction movie, I mean outer space movie you might say, where they went to the moon and there weren't any monsters or anything else. And for its time in 1950, it was just as accurate as you could possibly get. You couldn't get any closer than that. He had the first spacewalk.
This was back when Hollywood was going to the science fiction writers to begin with. I just say something that went out of fashion very quickly. It was only, when you look at the original boom films, there was The Thing, which was based on a science fiction writer's novella. There was War of the Worlds, obviously based on H.G. Wells. He came from outer space. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, again based on a Ray Bradbury story. And for a while there, the filmmakers were actually using science fiction as their basis for their films. But the fashion went out very quickly when they realized they could write any old track and get away with it.
Danger, adventure, and breathtaking thrills come rocketing to the screen as science smashes a new frontier in the world of tomorrow. See a man-carrying rocket travel 240,000 miles to land on a spaceship. See man explore the desolated areas of the moon. See for the first time thrilling pictures of the world of tomorrow.
The Joint Chiefs have conferred with the President and it's been decided to change your mission. You are now Moon Base number 1. You will remain where you are and show the flag until such time as you can be relieved by a larger permanent force.
I think one of the classics is certainly Forbidden Planet. Oddly enough, of course, it's based on Shakespeare's The Tempest, so They had a fairly good script writer to begin with.
Science fiction works best when it's artistically ambitious and when it's allegorical and when it's using classic texts. I mean, there's no reason why sci-fi shouldn't deal with exactly the same themes that Shakespeare dealt with. I mean, the genre is completely capable of supporting those themes. But when the public say, oh, we don't want that, you know, we'd like robots fighting on Mars, please, and can you stop all this arty nonsense? Studios hate it. So they ran away with their heads in their hands saying, that's it. Arty science fiction, forget about it. We want robots fighting on Mars.
On toward Mars, with disaster threatening at every moment. Human emotions caught up in the terrific tension of the flight. Here is the suspense, the surprise, the drama of the unknown. Flight to Mars.
We have been expecting you. You will come with us now.
Amazing underground Martian cities.
In the modern era, if you're willing and able to to stay the course and bring out your wallet and and push for it, you can put virtually any image convincingly on a screen. And of course, the immediate casualty was any other aspect of the film.
It's a completely wrong idea to believe that sci-fi is obsessed with special effects. It isn't. Bad sci-fi is obsessed with special effects.
Visual effects are all part and parcel of the science fiction scenario in these kind of films. You know, when people say that special effects are stealing the show and becoming all too important in a feature film, I think that's a sort of kind of silly thing to say, because the subject matter itself lends itself so clearly to special visual effects. I was always very inspired by the work of Douglas Trumbull, initially on 2001, with his breakthrough visuals, that I don't think anyone had sort of seen before. And a great deal of the credit should go to Stanley Kubrick for that.
What Kubrick tried to do was to take science fiction into the future by being very somber, by working very methodically through getting rid of the idea of fantasy. He was actually putting sort of space travel into realistic terms.
With Kubrick's films, there's a sort of a classic composition with his shots. They're very simple, they have an enormous grandeur to them. They'll never date.
One of the things that 2001 is applauded for is that it's scientifically very accurate. There is no noise in outer space, which is very correct, and it takes 7 months or whatever it is to get to Jupiter and that kind of thing. Actually, ironically, I think that's one of the things that marks it as not a science fiction movie, because its dependency on scientific accuracy seems to me to undermine the other ideas in the film. It seems to me that Kubrick is more concerned about getting the scientific accuracy right than he is about exploring the kind of allegorical subtext of the stories themselves. Now, of course, Arthur C. Clarke is a very scientific man, a very scientific writer, and is very concerned with genuinely extrapolating the way in which mankind is going to progress.
When I wrote 2001 about going to the moons of going to Jupiter, I thought that was it. But then the Voyager space probes went there and showed what fantastic places these were, and I was able to write 2 more books based on what the scientists had discovered. So there'll always be a moving frontier of scientific knowledge, but the science fiction writers can move on beyond the frontier.
I think people go to SF movies for very different reasons. An SF movie that I would love as a movie, I wouldn't even bother to read as a book. And I think it's the spectacle, it's the special effects, it's the atmosphere, it's all of that. It's just the sheer thrill of seeing this stuff brought to life.
I'd forgotten how much I hate